Yeah.
Welcome to Women Who Fights podcast. We empower female fighters to take full agency over their training. Our goal is to celebrate and inspire others with the incredible action women and allies are taking to level the playing field. We talk to experts, uncover prejudice, and champion what's driving our progress. And today,
And today,
go on.
and today we got Stacy Sims, who is a really well-known researcher focusing on women-specific considerations for sports performance. Welcome, Stacy. We are huge fans of your work. We've both read Raw, which was one of those texts that opened my eyes to the idea of celebrating my hormones instead of condemning them.
Yay!
Because it was suddenly using them rather than making they felt like they were dragging you through the mud. And it was one of the reasons we started Women Who Fight was because we wanted to support women through their training, because we both trained jiu-jitsu, and at the beginning we were at a loss to so many things to do with training around your cycle. So when we read Raw, I was like, I think I read it last year, and I was like, oh my God, I'm finally reading. I wish I had this Bible for when I first started.
Yeah, me too.
Exactly. So we'd love to start with how you ended up doing something so fundamentally important.
So basically, I want everyone to understand that everything I do is selfishly driven. I laugh and jest kind of in that, where it all started when I was an athlete and I was trying to get answers from myself and other teammates, trying to understand why some of the training mechanisms worked for us sometimes and not others, but they always worked for the guys. And when I started asking these questions as a student at university, I was getting answers like, oh, we don't know enough about women. We just generalize. We throw out results because they're anomalies. Just a lot of things that just didn't make sense. And then as you become an academic and start reading more and more studies and looking and saying, wait, I'm not represented in any of these studies as a female. What's going on? So I started really digging into it and had the opportunity as an academic and an athlete to be able to go in and ask these questions and try to answer them. And along the path of career, met some amazing people, and one of them was Celine Yeager, who is really well known as the Fit Chick who writes for bicycling, women's health, involved in a lot of different sport activities, was a professional mountain biker, just has a lot of kudos as well. And she came on a camp that I did, and she's like, you know what, we have to write about this. We have to create a book to put all the stuff that you're putting out there in the world into one cohesive place. So pitched it to Ben Rodell, now Penguin, and they're like, this is awesome, let's do it. So that's how the book came about. It came just from people you know and wanting to spread the information.
That's amazing.
Yeah,
That's
absolutely.
amazing. So at Stanford University, Shanti, do you want to say something?
I was just going to say, what were some of your biggest findings that you've discovered throughout your earlier research then? What are the major differences between men and women?
Well, we know that there are sex differences from birth that aren't talked about, from the way that we fuel different activities. Women tend to spare carbohydrate, use some more amino acids and fat as a fuel. We can't carbo load, and that's endemic in so many different events. Oh, you need to carbo load to have enough glycogen. We're already at a maximum fatty acid oxidation capacity. So things like the ketogenic diet, they don't work for us. Metabolic efficiency is all based on male stuff. Recovery windows are different. Things like a few days out before your period where you've lost your mojo and you feel really flat and depressed, it has to do with estrogen crossing the blood-brain barrier, not because you're that time of the month you're feeling bloated. It's because there's an actual physiological change. So there's a lot of things that have come out, and you look at just the general response to women in their training, and they'll put down to a point, oh, that day of training really sucked. I must not have slept enough, or I must be not fit enough. So all these negative conversations that we all have had with ourselves really ends up coming down to our physiology. And the way the physiology changes makes us think, makes our training work or not work on particular days. But no one really discusses that. No one really has discussed it until now. And so early days when finding this out and trying to implement it, there's a lot of pushback. There's a lot of pushback because being a female academic and a male-oriented medical and sports science like field, it's really hard to get a voice to include women because they haven't really been included, and to champion women as being different. So it's been a long push and a long time coming, but now we're getting a lot of traction, which is fantastic.
That's great. That's great. For those that for those women that follow men's general advice for men, what are the problems with that?
Well, I mean, if we look at just the general training programs that are out there for men, even from like your periodization of a training program, your 3 weeks on, 1 week off, what you're lifting, how you're recovering, women haven't reached their performance potential because we haven't been able to really activate our own physiology. So when we start looking at these different training metrics and we see a lot of female athletes that are getting, quote, burnt out, overtrained, they're not progressing in their training adaptations, there's a lot of undercurrent that has to do with the lack of recovery, the lack of proper fueling, things like fasted training. That just is a double whammy for women because one, we already have an elevation of cortisol, so we start off in a breakdown state. And two, we have a more sensitive threshold for the need of calories and nutrition than men do. So once we hit that threshold, we start having a downturn of our thyroid. We have a downturn of our endocrine system, and it only takes 4 days of it. We start getting these implications. So if we look at like the general training program that's been out there, there's a lot of things you can download off the web, and I've been downloading them and telling women how to tweak them because if that's their only resource, that's their only resource. But if you're able to look at something and see how it's scoped out and it's just put through a male lens, and then understanding how you can overlay your menstrual cycle and change it, you can actually look and see how different it should be. It's not a really hard implementation to do, but it makes it different enough that you're getting proper recovery. You're able to go hard when your body says, let's go hard. And the whole idea about training is to put your body under stress. So you want to put your body under an extreme stress when it can handle it so that you recover really well, so you get that training adaptation. But if we're putting ourselves under a high load when our body isn't ready for it or is a little bit more fatigued, like the 5 to 7 days before your period starts, no matter how much high load, you're still not reaching that top point that you really want. So you're not going to maximize that stress for that training, and then you're slower to recover. So it's kind of a moot point. That's a time where she's looking more technique and working more on not the so much intensity stuff, but more the neuromuscular and the mobility and the flexibility, because that's what your body absorbs best at that point in time. So when you start looking across your menstrual cycle or how you're taking an oral contraceptive pill and overlaying it on your training, you can really maximize your performance and get more out of your training at better fitness adaptations.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is like such a key element. I think both me and Marina have experienced. I think everyone who's ever done exercise every woman has experienced that. And Marina was just saying like earlier, like when like she was like on her period, like she had like sorry Marina, I'm diving in.
Not the code, go for it.
Two like days of feeling completely like flat, couldn't get out of bed. And I can totally like, I get the same when I'm training hard on my PMS. I will be like day 25, 26, I'll be like, I can't function. And it sort of feels like there's this huge expectation that you're still supposed to be able to go to the gym and train really hard. And it's like, have you trained today? Have you trained? When did you last?
Mm-hmm.
And how do you approach that? So how do you actually use those hormones? Like what's like, is there like a blueprint that women can find to follow so that they can like harness their hormones? Because you're talking about it, you've touched on some elements, but is there like a sort of a program that they can find to follow?
Yeah, I can give a general schematic and then I'll talk about some of the other applications that are out there that will feed back to you. So if we look at what a typical menstrual cycle is, we say that it's relatively 28 to 35 days, and day one is the first day of bleeding. And the low hormone phase is the one that fluctuates. So if you have a longer cycle, then you'll end up with a longer time in a low hormone phase. And that low hormone phase is estrogen and progesterone are low right before ovulation. Then ovulation hits, you have a surge of estrogen, and then it drops off a little bit. Then estrogen and progesterone start to rise, and they rise across the high hormone phase or the luteal phase, which lasts about 14 days. Hormones drop, and your period starts again. So we look at that schematic. In the low hormone phase, this is where we are, quote, more like men, where we can access carbohydrate, our core temperature is lower, we have better recovery. We definitely can hit high intensities really well. We have more mojo, we have more ability to recover from high stress from a metabolic standpoint, but also from a neuromuscular standpoint. So when we're looking at doing really intense training, the low hormone state is when you want to do that intense training. Then around ovulation, some women feel bulletproof and some women feel flat. And that depends on how they respond to estrogen. Because with that estrogen surge, some women who feel bulletproof can go really, really hard in and around that 24 to 36 hours, get a really strong training stimulus and recover well. Other women who feel flat around that surge, then they feel really fantastic a few days after. That's when they can put in that last big hard set of training and recover well. But then as estrogen and progesterone start to rise, maybe the 10 days before your period starts, this is more steady state work. It's not that top end, but you don't have to fully recover either. Your body's changing in its metabolic capacities and kind of how you're feeling from a central nervous system aspect where you can handle that moderate intensity and recover really well. But then when you get into that 5 to 7 days or that PMS stage right before your period starts, this is where your hormones are the highest, and this is where we can't access carbohydrate well. Estrogens cross the blood-brain barrier, so we have more central nervous system fatigue. Our core temperature is higher, so we have less heat tolerance. Our body is in a more catabolic state because progesterone breaks down tissue to release fuel for building the uterine lining. So in that regard, we want to look at deloading or working more technique-oriented stuff. And we're looking at nothing that's cardiovascularly taxing. And we can look at it as more that recovery week where we're absorbing all the hard training that we've done earlier in the cycle. And it sounds like we're talking about a 3-week on, 1 week off, but we're not, because ovulation changes, the low hormone, high hormone, all of those are really specific to a woman and her own unique cycle. So if you're tracking your own cycle and seeing how you feel on particular days, you start to get a patterning. Say on day 23 or day 25 of your cycle, you always feel flat and awful. And you know that, well, that's probably a day you're going to do some really good active recovery, maybe working more mobility, just moving. You're not having a training specific goal other than moving and working on the mobility and flexibility aspect. Let's say day 21, you feel bulletproof and on fire, then that's a day you can go really hard. So you can either track using pen and paper and writing down how you feel versus your training, making notes in your training log, or you can use something like Wild AI, which is one of the newer apps that's out there that uses artificial intelligence to learn your cycle. So you don't have to keep the notes. It can feed back to you and say, hey, on these days we notice that you really feel flat. So maybe you should try altering and going a little bit more on the recovery standpoint. So, you have the extremes of the applications of how to actually track. But the most important thing is understanding your cycle and how you respond to different patternings within training.
Absolutely.
I have 2 questions. So one question is, what if you are on a competition day? What would you do? Would you schedule it not to, would you plan in advance not to do it? And if you do it, how you do it? And the second question is, you've changed completely my period because of the cocktail pills you've suggested 7 days before bleeding. And
Yeah.
that complete, like I was telling,
Yeah.
Shanti's here to tell you, I had nightmares with the pain that I had, and all of this has gone. So can you tell us what these are? Yeah, go on.
Yeah, so it's two different scopes. First, I'll talk about the period cocktail. And the whole aspect of your period is based on an inflammation cycle and the release of what we call prostaglandins.
Yeah.
And prostaglandins is an inflammation cytokine. So when we talk about what the period cocktail is, we know that when you're building uterine lining, your body uses more zinc and magnesium. And so we up our zinc and magnesium to make it available for building tissue, but also our immune system. Because if our immune system is elevated, then inflammation is not as bad. The other aspect of using aspirin or ibuprofen is they're very specific to the prostaglandins. So it's looking at how are we going to stop as many receptor sites being affected by the prostaglandins. So we start using omega-3 fatty acids and a baby aspirin because those are the two most effective ones of affecting specifically prostaglandin E2, which is the estrogen-driven prostaglandin. So if we're using those, we mitigate or downturn inflammation, so it's not as painful, it's not as severe. We know that estrogen can exacerbate inflammation. So if you're down regulating it, then you don't have as much. You don't have as much inflammation, you don't have as bad a period, you don't have as much pain. So over the course of 3 cycles, by doing this, then you're really teaching your body not to have such a strong inflammation response to hormones dropping and prostaglandin being released. So that's one of the aspects of what that cocktail does. When we talk about performance versus training, so we know that if you have a specific performance scheduled, we can't change it, right? We can't change events and be like, hey, world champs is on this day, but it's the day before my period starts. There are ways of leveling the playing field. One, we know that a specific point in time doesn't have that much of an effect because mentally you can supersede a lot of the things that happen from a physiological standpoint. But we can also enhance that mental capacity by enhancing your physiology. So say you have your biggest comp the day before your period starts, and usually you feel awful and flat. Well, we know that we want to increase your plasma volume because it's dropped a little bit. So we want to increase your heat tolerance. We want to increase your sweating capacity. So we do a little bit of sodium loading. We do that by having chicken soup or miso soup the night before. You can have a hyperhydration drink the morning of. We use branched chain amino acids before comp so that you're getting more leucine crossing the blood-brain barrier, so that affects central nervous system fatigue in a positive way. We look at supplementing with carbohydrate during the comp so that you can hit those intensities. So there's specific things that you can do to level the playing field. Because I don't want any woman to say, oh, there's a really bad point in my cycle. It's being aware of how you feel. And then when it comes to competition, you can put specific things in to level it. Training is a different scope. You want to work with your hormones so that you maximize your training and fitness potential. The competition, again, is a different idea. And we know that you can't change the world schedule around your period. So again, it helps to know how you feel so you can put these specific things in to level that playing field.
That's absolutely amazing. I think that's so interesting because I think so many, it's that time when you go to your competition, you're like just dreading it and you drag yourself and you're like, oh no. And you go in with the thought process that I'm probably going to lose or I'm not going to do well because I'm on my period or I'm not feeling great because I know. But if you've got those tools just mentally, that would sort of, I feel like that would help so much.
Yeah.
And how
I can't tell you how many races I've done. And I'm like, oh, I think my period is going to come today. And it does. It comes during the race, right? And usually I feel super flat and awful. But knowing that, been able to mitigate it, and then it becomes a non-issue. And I have so many athletes in and around Kona World Championships. Like, my period is going to come that week. My period is going to come on race day. Part of it is stress and the training and the tapering that makes your cycles change, and inadvertently it's going to come. But again, when you have those tools, like you're saying, then it becomes a non-issue.
Definitely. And how how does this advice that you've given change? Because menopause is a big thing, and not me and Marina are I feel like I'm trying to prepare myself. Like I'm learning a lot.
Yeah.
And people around me are going through it, and so it's as how does the advice change when you hit menopause, and also why is I've been trying to persuade my mum to do some weight training. She's really into yoga. She loves her yoga.
Oh,
But I've been teaching her how to use a dumbbell, and it is really fun. But why is it so
awesome.
important for women? Why is weight
And
training?
also, can we also touch on why is it that they not shouldn't, but why cardio is not the right thing? Because my mom has just found out cardio, and I'm like, mom.
Yeah, I know. So the thing about it is, as I explained how the hormones affect every system of our body, well, they do. And so when they start to change in perimenopause, the time points leading up to that one point in time that's called menopause, um, you have a lot of changes that happen within your body. So you put on more visceral or that deep abdominal body fat, you have a really hard time leaning up. Your training responses aren't the same. You might feel like you wake up every night kind of anxious and not able to sleep, and you might feel like you're getting squishy and you're tired and you're burnt out. And it's all an affect of progesterone estrogen ratios changing. Sometimes you'll have more estrogen, sometimes you'll have a surge of progesterone, and they affect every cell in the body. And when we hit menopause, so I should really be specific, we're kind of renaming menopause as the birthday on the calendar of the rest of your life. Because menopause itself is just one day on the calendar that marks 12 months of no period. Leading up to that is perimenopause. After that is postmenopause. So then when we're in postmenopause, which is the new biological state, because we don't have estrogen and progesterone to help our bodies build lean mass, build bone, use carbohydrate efficiently, we have to look at external stressors to replace that. So we look at exercise stress of doing that. Women's bodies are already really, really capable of going along and slow. And that's not a hormone effect. That's a sex difference that I was talking about at birth, where our muscles are really primed for using fatty acids. We have more of a predisposition for endurance rather than power. So in order to be able to change your body comp, get really good bone density, maintain power, we have to look at the kind of training and nutrition that we're doing. So we need to do really high intensity, so that polarized training where high intensity is at top end, and the recovery is really, really low end. None of this middle, like jog for 80% of your heart rate kind of stuff. That is not appropriate for the perimenopause, postmenopause set. It promotes cortisol, it promotes body fat, it promotes the breakdown of lean tissue. The high intensity, that helps with a stimulus to put carbohydrate into the muscle without having to use insulin, causes an epigenetic change within the muscle, so your body becomes more sensitive to insulin, so that becomes a non-issue. It's also a very strong stimulus to put on lean mass, as long as you follow it up with good protein so that your body's getting the nutrients it needs to finish that cycle to get the lean mass going. And that high intensity and is really good for bone development too. Then when we think about lifting heavy is really super important because we want that neuromuscular consideration. We lose that ability to produce power, to have a really strong contraction. So we need to revisit how we're training and get that stimulus from that external stress of exercise. And so that's why lifting is so important. Not only is it for maintaining power and postural muscles, but also, again, for keeping and building lean mass. And it's not the 8 to 12 reps, 3 sets. That's more endurance. We're not looking for that. We're looking for that 0 to 6 reps, really heavy neuromuscular, not cardiovascular work. Because we're looking at high intensity, we're looking at the jump training or the plyometrics that still fits into high intensity, and the lifting heavy stuff. Then all of that takes the place of what hormones used to do for us. And we also know that the fitter you are, the less you are bothered by vasomotor symptoms, night sweats, that kind of stuff. So if we're looking at exercise and following up with sound nutrition, then it helps with that menopausal transition. We have less of an impact on our body composition. We end up in a fitter, more stable state once we go through that flat line of hormones. And then when we hit that postmenopause, which is our biological state for the rest of our lives, then we're already set up. We're already set up to be strong, to be fast, to maintain a high quality of life. We don't fall into those traditional images of the menopause where women don't have muscle, they have a big belly, they have a Dowager's hump, they have a risk for osteoporosis, because that's been taken care of by the exercise and training that we've changed.
When you're talking about the nutrition, what would you cut? Not cut. What would you eat less? And what would you? I assume you would have more protein. The ratio would be
Definitely
different,
more
right?
protein. Yeah, so post-exercise, we're looking at that 35 to 40 gram hit. One, we need that to increase leucine circulating to get to our brain and also to get to the muscle, so we get that stimulus for lean mass development. When we're talking about carbohydrates, we're not talking about cutting them, but we're talking about the kinds that we're eating. So we're no longer looking at the pastas and the rices and the grains. We're looking more at fruit and veg, getting our complex carbs that way. If you want pasta, then looking at more of your pulse-based pasta. So it's a higher protein, less carbohydrate oriented. Um, so there's a couple of things there. It helps because we end up having more of a decrease in our sensitivity to insulin and our body's ability to handle carbohydrate. But also by eating more fibrous fruit and veg, you're promoting really good gut health. And we need really good gut health because the deep bacteria helps with estrogen metabolism, because we do have a lower dose of a more negative estrogen and we don't want that to become predominant. Helps with brain tissue as well. It produces more what we call BDNF, which is brain neurotrophic factor, which helps with keeping brain tissue healthy, which is for cognition and reaction time and all that kind of stuff. So if we look at increasing protein, changing the type of carbohydrate that we're eating, and not being afraid of fat. We need fat. Most women get to this middle age point and they're like, oh, I can't have fat because I'm getting fat. But no, you want fat. You want fat, right? And you're looking at, more of the plant-based fats.
Okay. Cool. You touched on the microbiome there, how it's a very important. I mean, my experience is I used to get very foggy in my brain, and I think that was, and then I started sort of slightly doing time restricted eating, and that really sort of sorted me out, and no bread.
Mm-hmm.
But what's the importance of gut for your performance in terms of like energy, and what are the signs that people might not have a very healthy one? Because I think obviously like people are so inflamed when they're training. Is that also reflected in your gut as well?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things we talk about inflammation from training. Inflammation is interesting because you have an innate response, which is like an acute injury, a cut or pathogen that comes in, and you know what inflammation is there. We see it. It's a red swelling kind of thing. But then we have what we call systemic inflammation. And systemic inflammation comes from injury of cells from metabolic use. So, you have a leaky gut, and those cells that get a little bit injured from leaky gut, they secrete little metabolites that then cause the immune system to be like, oh, we need to do something about this. So there's a small inflammation response. But it is not enough to be like, whoa, I'm sick, but it's enough that your whole body stays in this more inflamed, stressed response. So we're talking about gut health. We're talking about not the upper intestines where people are like, oh, take probiotics. We're talking about the deep gut, which is where fiber goes for being digested. It's primarily what people say, oh, well, it's an insoluble fiber. But that is what feeds the gut bacteria. And it's really important to have a really wide diversity of gut bacteria in the lower colon or the lower intestines, because they're responsible for synthesizing vitamins, synthesizing cofactors for brain health, for endocrine function, for things even like cardiac rhythm. So all of their little metabolic components of fatty acids, butyrates, all of those go to help our body stay healthy. So if we're not taking care of our gut by eating a wide variety of fruit and veg, regardless of what age you are, then we start to compromise our gut bacteria. And we see that through inflammation, through poor sleep, anxiety, depression, um, some low-grade anemia or iron deficiency. And a lot of times, more robust is candida or yeast infections, some IBS or irritable bowel syndrome. So these are some of the factors that we find when you have poor gut health. And it's not that easy of going, oh, well, let's just take some probiotics, because again, you're not affecting the gut bacteria that you want to affect. So it has to be done through food.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's fantastic. And also, you just moving on swiftly. What you touched on the contraceptive pill, and I know that this is like a bit of a very strong opinions both sides, because obviously it is an amazing magic pill that means that women can choose when to get pregnant and when they don't want to be pregnant. But there are also side effects. And can you just talk to us a little bit about that and the pros and cons?
It's a crash course.
It's a crash course. So I sit on that fine line between health and performance. So I'll sit in, like we had a working group meeting on Friday where it's a group of endocrinologists, sociologists, physiologists, dietitians, that kind of stuff. And the endocrinologists are always like, no, the pill is fine. It's great. You can manipulate your cycle. There's no infertility risks unless you have something undercurrent before you get on the pill. And from a performance factor, I'm like, no. Because from a performance standpoint, we know that recovery is compromised, top end intensity is compromised. You don't have a real period when you're using the pill. It's a withdrawal bleed. So it masks if you're actually adapting or overtraining. So there are lots of things that are just on the cusp. So if I look at an athlete, I'm like, okay, you want to be on a contraception. Do you really need to be on a combined oral contraceptive pill for health reasons, for endometriosis or for PCOS or anything like that? Most of the time it's no. I've just been told I'll go on the pill because it's an easy contraception, or I had irregular periods, or I had bad skin. It's like, well, that's an undercurrent. We don't want you on the pill for that. We want to see what your endocrine system is doing. If you have heavy bleeding, then actually the Mirena IUD is the best medication for it, because that low dose progestin actually helps mitigate heavy bleeding, and it doesn't downregulate your natural endocrine system. So we can actually see if you're adapting or not. You still have your natural cycle going. You just don't have you don't ovulate per se for the first 6 to 8 months. And it's the most effective form of contraception, and it's there for 5 years. Because when we look at a combined oral contraceptive pill, in the first 2 to 3 days of the active pill, you recover really well. And your heart rate variability or your parasympathetic system is activated pretty well. And then you get into about 2.5 weeks of the steady state hormone profile, where it's a whack of hormone right when you take the pill, and then there's half-life where 12 hours later, it's half that strength. So your body's getting these perturbations of high and low every day. And when we see that high and low every day, what happens is your recovery and your ability to adapt to strain is reduced. So if we were to take a naturally cycling woman and a woman on a pill and match them for hormone profiles, the woman who's naturally cycling can hit a high intensity session and recover really well. But the woman on the pill has delayed recovery to that same high intensity session. So from an athletic standpoint, that's not a really good way to, I guess, attack training, right? You can't phase your training according to an oral contraceptive pill either, because you have that 3 weeks of really active high hormone perturbation going up and down every day. And it's much higher than your natural biological state. And then that sugar pill week or withdrawal bleed is also not a low hormone state, because your body rebounds and you have FSH and LH coming up, you have an estrogen surge. So again, it's not a low hormone state. So when we're talking about oral contraceptive pill, yeah, it's really effective as contraception, and it's good enough if you are not being competitive or you're not really wanting to maximize performance. So recreational athletes, if you choose to go that way, that's fine. But when we're looking at women who are really focused on performance, maximizing performance potential, there are alternatives that are much better at doing both. So, when you're trying to make the decision of what you're trying to do for contraception, if you have undercurrent of health reasons, say you need a little bit of estrogen, well, yeah, you can't get away from the OC. But if you don't, then going with a progestin-only pill, which has a minimal effect on your performance. We also know that it mimics more of a natural cycle, except for the last 4 to 5 days of the high hormone state, where you don't have a big a whack as you do with your natural cycle, because progestin modulates some of your natural progesterone effects. So it's better in some regards in the high hormone phase. But the really best one is a low dose progestin IUD. So the Kelar, the Skylo, or the Marina, because it doesn't downregulate your natural hormones. It's very effective for 5 years, and you have a fail-proof way of contraception.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I was on the I think I was on a progesterone only pill when I was younger, and I was on it for a few years, and then when I came off it, I had the worst period pains. I grew up without period pains, and then I went on the pill, and I didn't even notice my period. I didn't have like a problem, and then I came off the pill and I had a problem for like 2 or 3 years. It took me.
Yeah, and it can be like the point of time when you went on the pill. If you're in your teens, your body hasn't fully developed a cycle, so you most likely would have had those issues, but you went on the pill. And the pill is a great masking agent, and you don't really know what's going on with your body when you're on a pill. And if you come off it and you have really bad period pains and heavy bleeding, which a lot of female athletes have and no one really talks about, well, there are ways to mitigate it. You can do it through nutrition, but again, like I keep talking about the IUD, the technology has changed, so it's not hard to insert. It's not that uncomfortable. If you have really heavy bleeding when it first starts, you might have that for the first cycle or 2 cycles, but you can control it a little bit with the period stack there's talking about, and then it completely disappears because the IUD is effective in changing the thickness of the uterine lining. And if it's not that thick, you don't have as much prostaglandin being released to cause uterine contractions.
Yeah.
You're such a great communicator. You've just
thanks.
You've just explained so many concepts so easily. I'm like, great. I'm gonna say that.
Awesome. Thanks.
So, how do you see women's sports science moving forwards, and what are some of the greatest, how shall we call them, barriers, if you wanna call them barriers?
So in the past 4 or 5 years, we've expanded the conversation. So it's becoming more and more apparent that we have to do more research on women. One of the big barriers that still exists is women not wanting to participate. Part of it is the fear factor of not really understanding. Part of it is the intimidation of it's primarily been men in it. There is a lack of advertising for women to be involved in studies and participation. So that's one of the big barriers at the moment, is getting women to understand that, yes, if you want studies done on you, you also have to volunteer to participate. And it's not a scary thing. It's really not a scary thing. And part of it also is explaining that, yeah, now there are studies for women, so let's jump aboard. So again, it's that communication thing. There's been increasing backlash on those studies that don't include women, or say we didn't include them because of the menstrual cycle variations. So that's really refreshing to see. And with the global movement of women in sport and the greater amount of focus on women in sport and being strong and not a weak little pedal, is really opening up the scientific world to be, yeah, we need to include women to understand this. Not only in sports science, but in medical sciences. Like last week, they're coming out with, we need to reset the blood pressure thresholds for women versus men, because women, by the nature of being women, already have a lower threshold for blood pressure. So we need to revisit that. What is high blood pressure for women versus what is high blood pressure for men? So even simple things like that is starting to change and come out, which is fantastic.
That's amazing. Is there what else? Because I also heard that there was heart attacks were like completely different for men and women. Are there other things that we should be aware of where they're very different like that?
Yeah. So heart attack's really interesting because the typical signs and symptoms that we have for it is all male driven. A colleague of mine started women's heart health at Stanford and goes through all the things that women should look out for: heart attacks, for blood pressure, for stroke, for atrial fibrillation, because all of these are different. The cardiovascular system is different in women, especially when you go through the perimenopausal transition where estrogen starts to perturbate. So that's one major thing. When we start looking at how estrogen exposure and the lack of estrogen, so those epigenetic changes that occur, so there's differences in muscle, there's differences in fuel utilization, there are differences in metabolic syndrome. So pretty much every public burden disease that you hear about, they are having to relook at it from a molecular standpoint because women are so different. So it's like, be aware, watch this space, because more and more research is coming out where women will finally be like, I knew I should have been on a statin and I didn't have to, or I knew I should have done this, this, and this. So yeah, it's interesting world in the biomedical research right now.
Yeah. Are there other
It's
people you feel are
crazy.
doing similar things to not similar things to you, but really focusing in on women specific research? Have you got people that you are seeing starting to do that more and more around you?
Yeah, there's quite a few that are doing a lot of like rat research and mouse modeling, because a lot of the mouse models also are not on female mice. And so there was a couple of papers that came out of Colorado saying this was the biggest sex difference that we've ever seen in our lives of doing biomedical research and cellular research, right down to the cell model. So yeah, like I said, it's infiltrating all the way down to the mechanical and the mechanistic aspects, all the way up to whole human studies. In sports science, there's three primary groups that are doing female-specific research. We have stuff in the UK with Kirsty Elliott-Sale, Catherine Ackerman out of Boston and Boston Children's Hospital. There's me down here in New Zealand with a couple of my colleagues, and then Claire Minahan and a couple of her colleagues in Australia. So it's like we're covering the world in in the equator standpoint, but not from a diagonal standpoint. Or maybe we are if we go Australia to the UK. But yeah, so, and we collaborate in some and we argue in some, but for the most part, we're all trying to get a distinctive message out about how we promote female athlete health. And what is a female athlete? It's any woman that exercises for a purpose.
Okay. I like that definition. That makes a lot of sense to me. And
Yeah.
you mentioned that women are not wanting to take part necessarily in the studies, which is part of the problem. Is there anything else that we, as like anyone listening or any like public people can do to sort of push towards changing the imbalance of male and female research?
Funding is another thing, right? So pushing for funding for female specific research. Funding is tight across the board in all sectors, and in sports science and nutrition world, it's super tight. So people are like, oh, we got to get this done in a certain timeline. And the way that a lot of people do it is they go with the patriarchal old school model of this is the time point, let's fit in the men, instead of saying, hey, we have female athletes and this is how we have to do it between menstrual cycle phases. So this is our timeline. So instead of being dictated, oh, you have 1 month to get it done, being able to dictate back, we need 3 months and we need funding for 3 months to do this as a study for women, do it well.
Okay.
So for every female listening as well, we need to make sure that we get this message across. You eat according to your cycle, you train according to your cycle. If your trainer doesn't take that into consideration, maybe change a trainer and take part in studies.
Yeah.
Is that the 3 pillars?
That's
perfect.
Good.
What are you working on at the moment? So that we sum up.
Gosh, so many things. So
Give us the
coming up with
highlights.
the highlights. So July, we're publishing a follow-up to Roar for the perimenopause menopause set.
Oh,
I know.
My
my
mom's
mum
going to
will
be
be
very, very
so
happy.
pleased.
So frantically going through the edits. So that's exciting. We have lots of really cool studies going on looking at resistance-trained women and phase-based training for resistance-trained women, because nothing's been done on that, right? So if you're an Olympic lifter or you're strength-oriented, instead of having to generalize more out of the endurance world, we're looking specifically at strength women and how to phase-base with that. We're looking at ACL rehabilitation programs based on menstrual cycle phase, because ACL comes
Apparently,
like,
that's worse.
yeah.
You have times when it's worse, don't you?
Well, sort of. We hear that around ovulation, there's a greater incidence, and other people say, "Oh no, it's in the late luteal phase." But there isn't really a rhyme or reason. It depends on training load. So when we really look at the data closely, we look at training loads leading up, and if we look at those training loads, they're based on male modeling. If we are to change the training loads, then that injury risk most likely will decrease, right? Because when we look at the tissue strength and the tensile strength of the ligaments, yeah, they're a little bit more lax in or around ovulation because of estrogen, but not enough to be predisposed to injury. That's another myth. But it does happen still,
Busting.
right?
Lovely.
We still have ACL injury quite a bit in women. Part of it is having to relearn mechanics that aren't taught. But yeah, now we're looking at rehabilitation programs to really enhance rehabilitation for women based on menstrual cycle phase.
Wow.
We have sex difference stuff coming out because recovery from concussion is sex difference oriented. So depending on what phase of the menstrual cycle you're hit can impact on how you recover. So we're doing a lot of that work. We're looking at protein distribution and recovery. So really trying to get all of the stuff that becomes really apparent questions that haven't been answered. So there's a lot of stuff going on, which is exciting. A lot of
Yeah.
work, but it's still exciting. Yeah.
Yeah.
We hope you
You're
have many
really
women in your team so that you can filter it down and
Too.
you can make many Stacy Sims replicas for the time to come.
Trust me, it's not just me. I have lots of really capable, intelligent women surrounding me and doing a lot of this work with me, which is fantastic. Yeah.
Oh, that's
Right.
so it
Shanzi.
sounds to do what you're doing, it sounds like you need an amazing group of people with you as well. I had a thought, just a thought. You sort of mentioned like change does like the way that we've then been taught, if a lot of exercise, like I don't know if I'm just plucking this out of thin air, but if a lot of exercise is based on men doing it because 100 years ago women weren't necessarily doing an awful lot of pro sports, could then women change? Is the technique women are learning in the sports actually appropriate for women? Is
No,
that
I don't think
something in
so.
that?
There's
No.
something in that. Because at the onset of puberty, you have kids that are learning the same mechanics at elementary school, right? Or in kids' sport. But the onset of puberty, women's biomechanics and our gravity, everything changes. Our hips get wider, our shoulder angle widens so that our literally, so our hands don't hit our hips when we're walking. So everything kind of widens. We become a little bit more of that triangle shape. Our knees tend to go in, so there's a lot of potential more knee strain. We become more quad dominant. Our center of gravity drops, but we're not re-taught how to run, how to throw, how to land, how to jump, any of these things. So that carries on into adulthood, right? So we're looking at people who are being taught mechanics that come from the male lens. Even professional athletes who are doing box jumps, Olympic lifts, all this kind of stuff. They're not really taking into account what the female biomechanics are doing and capable of doing. And again, I put that as, we are still at a little bit of a performance disadvantage because we still haven't maximized what it means to work with female physiology and female biomechanics.
Definitely.
And we're going
I
to
feel like
close this interview.
I
Go on,
want to
go on, go on.
finish saying what I was saying.
Go on. Go on.
One
Marina's
more.
like,
Go for it.
on it.
I'm just very careful of the time because she has to go on. Yeah, God.
I know. Just because it's so interesting, because in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which is what we train, like when you fight a guy, like their hip movement, everything is so different. And then when I learned from a woman, there are certain details and things that they share that you're like, oh, I've just never, I learned it in this way. And it's just an interesting figuring out what is due to like gender and what is due to gender and what is due to the teacher. And so like taking that on board, just thinking about like weightlifting and, if you learn from a female trainer, like how they've adjusted it and learned, it's just such an interesting thing that I think that often we don't think about. So I just wanted to say that.
It is. No, I heard that. It's very interesting. Like with Olympic movements too, the snatch is very complex, right? And so they're like, you want to think about the shoulder shrug and then the hip extension. And that's male, really, because center of gravity for men is up a little bit higher. So when they have hip extension and they can drop under it because their center of gravity is higher. But for women, it's hip extension, pulling the bar up to boob line and then dropping under. And no one talks about that, right? So it's like, because your center of gravity is lower, you need to drop under, you want to think about that shoulder shrug coming all the way up to like where your heart rate monitor would be, or the lower part of your boob line, not just the hips, to be able to drop under it. So there's small things that happen even with Olympic weight training that the technique just isn't quite taught right to maximize performance for women. So you can take that and try your snatch.
Like, yeah.
Bloody hell.
My mind.
Wow. I didn't know that.
It makes so much sense. Because also sometimes you see guys, if you see them wrestling, oh my God, they're so fast. Like, it's amazing. And they wrestle and they're so powerful. And you watch women and they're doing the same thing, but they haven't got the same tools. Right. It's like they're trying to, do you know what I mean? It's like they're missing, they've got other tools.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is
right. Like, so it's a whole area of research that I want to push, but I'm not a biomechanist. So I'm trying to find biomechanists who understand these things, because a lot of biomechanists, even women in biomechanics, aren't really looking at it from that perspective. They're looking at how they've been taught and what they need to do. And they're not looking at, okay, well, everything I've been taught has been based on the data from digitizing all the hip angles, the knee angles, everything. But it's like we need to look and find female biomechanists that are like, hey, wait a second, let's look at these techniques and look at the body we're working with. Where's the center of gravity? What are the hip angles? What are the knee angles? What are the laning mechanics? All those things so that we can teach women how to maximize their techniques.
Absolutely.
So if there are any female biomechanists listening,
send them your way. Marina, go for it.
So that you're not late to your next podcast. I got so worried. All right. So the last question for you. You're on the spot now. What are you fighting for?
What am I fighting for? I'm fighting for equality for my daughter, because she's 8. And also equality across the board for what it means to be a woman. Because we hear on the extremes, like the trans society saying, I am a woman. And then you have the other end. If you don't have a period, you're not a woman. But I want equality across the board to bring context into the conversation so people understand what it means to them to be a woman and what that means to project onto other people so people understand it. And that's, I think, the only way we're going to bring equality into this entire conversation, because women are complex. Our physiology is complex. The way we grew up is complex. So if we bring context into it and we see equality, then it makes it easier for all the little 7 and 8-year-old girls who still have a long journey to go.
Yeah, brilliant. Give them some amazing tools and role models, and
that's the fight. Yep. Cool.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you so
much.
much.
Yeah, it was so fun. Great to meet you guys. Super fun.
Yeah.